Ladies and gentlemen, and non-binary, welcome our Dean, Scott Appleby.
Thank you, Mahan. Thanks to all of you. I want to thank everyone involved with this 3-day conversation, which is the third in a series, as I think you all know. And we want to thank the Arthur Vining Davis Foundations that has supported all 3 of the seminars, this being the culminating one, that are dedicated, as the people in this room know, to faith in the story. And this particular seminar, I was able to sit in a little bit, but I have heard great things about some very powerful stories that have been shared over the last 3 days that have to do with faith and people's struggles with faith, and the trialogue that yields so many great results and new ideas when we bring together, as we have in these 3 seminars, professors, journalists, and faith leaders, because that trialogue doesn't always unfold in other settings, and it leads to some really wonderful mutual learning and collaboration. So thank you all for being here. I am the Dean of the Keough School of Global Affairs, and our mission is to advance integral human development. And that is an inclusive concept that's rooted in that articulation in Catholic social teaching. But Catholic social teaching itself is, of course, an invitation to all people of faith or no faith who can reason together about what is good. And so we are pleased that that is our mission here in the Keough School, to focus on the dignity of each person and every person, regardless of their background, the identity markers that are imposed upon them, and can share kind of abundantly from their heart and their intellect and their very core of their being. And that's what's happened over these 3 seminars. So my one regret is that I wasn't able to be here every day of every meeting. But thank you all for doing that. I want to just take this opportunity to thank the director of the Ansari Institute, Mahan Mirza, and the staff of the Ansari Institute. I won't name everyone, but I want to point out Professor Alex Hsu, who really put this together and was one of the intellectual leaders to it. Thank you, Alex. And again, thanks to all of you who are participating. And I will be listening carefully and intervening probably too often in what follows, just to make up, to compensate. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dean. Alex, could we ask you, we want to begin with a land acknowledgement, and we'd like to ask you to do that first.
We acknowledge our presence in the traditional homelands of Native peoples, including the Haudenosaunee, Miami, Peoria, all of the Potawatomi peoples, and particularly the Pokagon Potawatomi, who have been using this land for education for thousands of years and continue to do so.
Thank you so much, Alex. All right, so let's get started. I'd like to start by just introducing myself, and then we'll have all of the panelists introduce themselves. My name is Sarah Ventry. I'm an audio journalist. I'm based in Phoenix, Arizona. I make audio documentaries in the podcast form, usually that are about religion and society. I have embedded in a fundamentalist Mormon community called Short Creek and did a podcast there. I also was very proud to work on the 2nd season of This Land about the Indian Child Welfare Act. And I'm so honored to be in conversation with these folks today. Shannon, do you want to go first?
Sure. Anya Chigig Vishak Bai Akimel O'otham Sapai Mashma Baamjij Gila River Indian Community Baamjij Arizona, or a place you Americans call Arizona. My name is my English name, my colonized English name is Shannon Rivers. I am not Irish. I am Akimel O'otham. I am from the river people of Arizona, Thank you very much.
I'm Jack Jenkins. I'm a national reporter with Religion News Service, also author of the book American Prophets, The Religious Roots of Progressive Politics and the Ongoing Fight for the Soul of the Country. And predictably, I cover religion and politics for a living. So.
Good to be with you all tonight. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Greetings and peace. I'm Celene Ibrahim, and I'm a scholar of early Islam. I focus on women and gender studies. And then I'm also a teacher in the Groton School of Religion and Philosophy.
Thank you all so much for agreeing to be in conversation with each other and with all of us. So one of the most interesting things that came out of our conversations all together as a group over the last 3 days, and particularly when we were in our trialogues, our groups of 3 people who all work in different disciplines, was that it became very clear very quickly, something that we all knew but don't often get to talk about in our fields, which is that religion does not exist in a vacuum, that it is constantly intersecting with politics, with civic life, with many, many, many aspects of our life and throughout our society. So I kind of want to just open it up, given that the theme of this, our time together was really about religious futures and looking to the future. Jack, I'd like to start with you, and then please, anyone can chime in. But I'd like to ask you a little bit about kind of like, as we near the end of 2022, we think about the new year, we think about coming into a new congressional session, we think about all of the national stories and international stories that have really centered on religion in the last year. What would you like to see change in the national conversation as we think about our priorities and how they intersect with faith?
Oh, it's a fascinating question. Thank you for that. One thing that has been true every year, really, but particularly in the past year, is that it's difficult to ignore the intersection of religion and politics in our society, whether that's prominent progressive people of faith advocating or staging a number of demonstrations or protests or protections, or the rise of Christian nationalism. I think these were things that were very difficult to ignore. Just in these midterms, a number of candidates were pretty, outwardly obvious about their embrace of aspects of Christian nationalism, and they were often bolstered by far-right activists who just identified themselves as Christian nationalists, and then members of Congress like Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene from Georgia did so as well. Most of those people didn't do very well on election night, which is an interesting story because a lot of these groups continue to exist. A lot of these fusions of a political identity and a religious identity are not going anywhere. And I think an important thing for reporters, whether they're political reporters or religion reporters, to look at is what those identities are going to look like now, right? We continue to deal with a polarized society. We have evidence, for instance, that evangelical identities, the term evangelical, there's some evidence that it kind of transcended a traditional theological identifier and moved into a more overt political identifier for some people. What does that mean for the landscape of religion and politics here in the United States, where, everything's political, but things have become even more overtly so in ways that show up in our body politic. So what I would hope, though, because at the same time, having said all of that, there's, depending on how you qualify Senator James Lankford, there is one ordained minister in the United States Senate, and that's Senator Reverend Raphael Warnock, right, who, referenced the Imago Dei in Scripture in his victory speech. And I think trying to look at all of those things as influencing our American story, whether that's elections, whether that's issues such as abortion, both people advocates for abortion rights as well as opponents of abortion. These are animating how we dictate policy, how we discuss and talk to each other, and of course, how people worship and pray. And I think taking that more seriously in this new year, particularly given how seriously political actors are taking it, will only benefit political journalists and religion reporters who are trying to animate the aspects of our populace that sometimes are hiding beneath the surface, but tend to show up on election days. I know it's kind of a little bit esoteric, but I think the guiding lodestar there is that religion still continues to animate our society in ways I think a lot of people don't expect. And that is not just white evangelicals. It's a broad corpus of faiths that are, that are really animating people's lives every day, and not just in ways, that are local, although those are very important. They are also impacting federal policy as well.
One of the things that I'm watching for as well is how newer minorities, newer religions to the landscape, I'm thinking of my own context with the Muslim communities, are learning the discourse of American politics in a way that they can speak into the public sphere in a way that is honest to their own religious identity and commitments, but that doesn't appear threatening or doesn't appear like that they're subtly encroaching, or that is the desire. So there's a practice of American politics, and it's something that I think new minority groups, as they enter and organize and form institutions, have to train and teach and learn. So I continue to be interested in how different minority groups are entering this rich public sphere of American discourse.
Shannon, that's something that you talked about during our 3 days also, and really thinking about the way that the discourse has happened and who is and is not included in that discourse. And I know also I'm thinking in particular of the Supreme Court case regarding the Indian Child Welfare Act that was just heard, and the decision hasn't been announced yet. But there are a number of ways in which tribal sovereignty and the cultural importance of Indigenous communities is really kind of coming under threat in a very public way right now. And I'm kind of wondering what you see as maybe a necessary shift, or like how should we be thinking about that conversation when we talk about religion and faith and politics?
Thank you for that question. I think for me, and I'll kind of borrow from the Poor People's Campaign, is there's a distorted moral narrative of Christianity. And that distortion has been, it's been a Western view since Manifest Destiny, since Columbus, since the Doctrines of Discovery, since the Papal Bulls, 3 that were written, and that continue to, and one of my friends here reminded us that the Supreme Court, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, cited the case of a McGirt case in Oklahoma, where land and territory are still under violation or under the doctrines of discovery, the rules of doctrine of discovery. So this distorted moral narrative still continues on with the United States and its imperialism. I am Indigenous, I am Native American, I am not American. And we need to, I am the First Nations people, so that, and it becomes uncomfortable to have these conversations. But in spaces like this, they need to, because people end up in the Supreme Court. Your children will end up in politics or in larger spaces that make these decisions. And America is one of the most ignorant countries in the world when it talks about its own history. And again, I think that, our brother Alex brought me here knowing that I wasn't going to be mincing my words. And I'm not doing that to shock you. I'm simply saying that we are adults, we are educated adults, and we have to understand that this distorted moral narrative that continues to violate the lives of Indigenous peoples, of the First Nations peoples, will continue to do so and will eventually trickle down to you. That the environment, that the way we treat Mother Earth, the policies and laws that violate our rights as human beings, our basic human rights, are always and constantly under threat. And this distorted moral narrative leads that conversation, especially here in the West.
And Shannon, I know kind of on that point, one of the other things we talked about was the ways in which our political system, our court system, the way we think about justice, the way we think about morality, the way the national conversation around these ideas is shaped, obviously has spiritual ideas or religious ideas kind of embedded into it or at it as part of its foundation. And I think one of the things that did come up in our trialogues also was, and also in our group conversations, was really thinking about the way that we think about justice, and we think about, like, in the context of a court case, for example, that it's one person versus another, that it's who damaged the other person, and we're thinking about individual parties. And I know one of the things that you talked about was really a need to sort of get rid of that entire framework altogether and stop thinking of it as this kind of individual politicians or individual laws or individual decisions, but rather as more of a collective system. Can you talk about that for a minute?
Sure, and I just want to give you all a little background, is that I'm a Native American spiritual leader or a chaplain within, they call us chaplains, but we're Native American spiritual leaders, and I typically enter level 4 institutions in California Department of Corrections, Arizona, and sometimes New Mexico. But what I see, what our sister here is talking about, is that when I walk into these prisons, I see predominantly Black and brown men. And justice is not something that is equal here in this country. Justice in the Western framework is about punishment and incarceration. It is not about reciprocity, or if you look at indigenous idea of justice, or balance, I should say, is that if you harm another individual, the other individual was to be responsible for that family from now on. If I were to hurt someone or kill, to even take their life, I was responsible for that family. And taking a life wasn't something that we weren't a bunch of savages, despite what the narrative is. We didn't run around carrying our bows and our arrows and hurt one another. We continue to live a life of balance, and we try to teach the world that. That's really difficult, because erasure constantly happens within the indigenous world, and the indigenous voice constantly is erased. Justice itself is an unbalanced thing here. It is not a balanced system. And the system of justice, America has the largest incarceration in the world. We are a developed country. We are next to Brazil and Russia and all these other countries, but we still house more people within these institutions. So justice is the way we look at justice is not through the lens of, it's through the lens of indigenous peoples, and it must be taught that way. And I'm not just talking about a physical incarceration, but I'm talking about justice to the land, to the resources, to the water, to the people, to those that have less than us. And I'm not just talking justice here in this country, but I'm talking around the world. So when we talk about justice, it becomes a very convoluted concept and narrowed into this Western ideology of justice, which is completely opposite of the way indigenous peoples, I would imagine, around the world think. I hope that answers.
Yeah. And so part of what we talked about too is the need then to deconstruct what we know, to deconstruct maybe the ideas that we're taught with, to deconstruct the aspects of our own faith traditions that might reinforce those ideas, and to start to think about things in a more holistic, collective way, where we're looking at things as interconnected systems rather than as separate, disparate parts. Celene, did you have something to add on that?
As I'm thinking about both my role as a scholar and a teacher, really, I'm thinking about how to take from these conversations and thread it through my syllabi, my research, my work. I'm thinking very much about the ways in which my learning specifically about Indigenous studies and the robust nature of the field. I've just gotten so much of an enriched perspective from listening to many of my colleagues who are here. And for me, I am actively thinking about what that means to work in institutions where I might be marked as a minority, but I have even more of a heightened awareness maybe of the ways in which I can use the the faculty position that I do have to be able to teach in new ways. It's really this whole experience these last 3 days has also broadened my horizons in terms of what I'm personally want to commit myself to reading, because I'm always, maybe like many of you, I'm reading in a certain bubble, in a certain niche. And that's not, when we think about that, it's not, I'm not just thinking like liberal sources or conservative sources. I'm thinking what crosses my horizon just kind of regularly in terms of issues to care about. And there's a way in which we maybe do some virtue signaling in our activism or things, but I'm trying to really learn from my colleagues here about the different justice issues that they're working on and how I might be able to take that into my teaching and scholarship. So we have in education certain kind of, maybe you might call it the colonial version of education in which I do work, has priorities on learning English or learning math, and these are considered the fundamental disciplines. But actually, I think something like a spiritual studies, where we seek to understand the different philosophical paradigms, the different cosmologies that are out there in the universe. I consider this, of course, being a religious studies teacher, I would, but this is a kind of a fundamental aspect of what should be laced through even our basic education. This shouldn't be just, philosophy shouldn't just be something you encounter in your 20s in an institution like this one. And it's absolutely essential if we're going to build a plural democracy that lives up to its ideals, that doesn't build its ambition on the backs of disenfranchised minorities. We have to prioritize learning about the peoples of the world in a way that is not just a factual learning, but that is an empathetic kind of embodied learning. And the other discipline that I would say is absolutely essential to be woven through even an early stage educational curriculum is the questions that the journalists are raising and the way that journalists go about their work, which is the deep listening, which is trying to discern the patterns, but also the anomalies. And fundamentally, the art of asking the questions, asking the right questions.
That is a perfect segue to my next question, which is for you, which is, so how do we develop a vocabulary for having these conversations? Because I think a lot of times, we're very fortunate to be in conversation with each other right now. We all kind of have some either specialized training, or we have dedicated huge, parts of our life to really thinking about these questions. And sometimes we have shared vocabularies and sometimes we don't, but how do we get these conversations outside of the academy, outside of the journalism conferences, outside of our churches and our masjids and our temples? And how do we begin to have these conversations with each other in a way where we can be productive about it and be inclusive?
That is a great question. Darn, she's a real journalist. So for me, thinking about my circles, the interfaith world, and faith might not even be the best term as we're wrestling with things, or interbeing, people have experimented with interspiritualities. I think integrating into these spaces that are very deliberately about encounter. Dialogue is one paradigm, but dialogue is only really a certain modality. And so I like to think about encounter. And so encounters across difference, and the putting spirituality in place of the language around religion, because of the many ways that religious institutions and religious dogma has harmed and excluded. And so the language of spirituality, someone's probably going to find it problematic eventually, but I think it's a way to incorporate a broader circle, people who see themselves as non-religious, people who are exploring different spiritualities, people who come from different identities that overlap in complex ways. And so this is the kind of the language that might help to bring people together, but it's also about what types of practices. And I think religious scholars, sometimes we think a lot about text or the orality of traditions. And that to me is still really important. It's still something that I think resonates. We are still a culture that reads, I think, even if in shorter and shorter increments, but especially the orality. So appreciating each other through our sensibilities around what we like to listen to, or what we do like to read. So I think of these book groups that are oftentimes formed that have been really transformational in many people's lives. The Daughters of Abraham is one that just comes to mind, but there are many others. So I think if we can keep this intellectual culture alive and think about it not as something we do as adults, but in maybe even in the younger stages, what are we doing to expose our children to worlds that are not their insular, more homogenous worlds?
Shannon or Jack, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I really appreciated being here with all of y'all, just because, as a journalist, one of the things we always carry around is an insecurity, is that we're missing important stories. And what that insecurity was proven to be extremely true while we were here, because I found out how many stories I was missing. It's a lot. But I mean, that, I think it can be really easy as a journalist, especially if you're covering politics and in short bursts, to kind of fall into this pattern where you're just, part of it's practical. Your editor's on your back. You got to get something out the door. Somebody wants to go to a soccer game. You want to get this piece done before you go. And so you're trying to just, use patterns that we have used before to cover something. And you use the designations of what is an important group and what is not an important group, even if that doesn't actually make any political sense, right? You just use the patterns that you've had in your brain and that you've used for years. The great thing about being in dialogue in places like this and spaces like this is that it reminds you of how much more is going on. And then in reality, you're actually missing a story by writing the bland version that nobody's going to read anyway. And so why not, we journalists hunt down those additional narratives, those additional stories. And for me personally, those intersections of religion, spirituality, belief, being, and politics, because they are shaping the way people vote. They are shaping the way people who get elected and run for office. And the more I listen to this group, the more I realize that I'm missing in the fields of advocacy and medicine and what have you. And so I just think it's a regular reminder that there is more to be hunted down. There's more to learn. And I'm just really grateful for the dialogues that we've had here. And I have a very long list of notes and story ideas. So you're all going to be getting calls from me soon. So
did you have anything to add to that, Shannon? Okay. So we're going to get ready to move to the sort of next portion of this conversation. So I just wanted to close this portion by asking you all, how do we know what stories are worth telling? There are a lot of stories to be told, and we have to ask ourselves what's worth our time to research and to tell. Who are we giving a platform to? What is the value of giving platforms to those people? Who are we leaving out of the conversation? How is in our roles as journalists, as faith leaders, as academics, that we have an opportunity to shape how people think and talk about these kinds of issues. So how do we know what stories are worth telling, and how should we tell them?
Well, I was telling the colleagues earlier that 80% of the books written about Native people are written by non-Native people. And what I said was, it depends on who's telling the story and why they're telling the story. And if you were to go on your computer right now or your phone and Google Native American, what you're going to find is a Native person from the 18th century, right, with the headdress, and we're all monolithic. We're not O'otham, we're not Lakota, we're not Cheyenne, we're not Pawnee, we're not Ojibwe or Potawatomi, we're all Lakota and we wear a headdress. And that's not who we are. So it depends on who you ask to write the story. You told a story about how you were invited into this community, the Mormon community. and you won their trust over. And so I think that's really important about who tells the story and why are you telling that story. The Indigenous story is not just one of difficulty and hardships, though that, unfortunately, that's many of the stories of Indigenous peoples. But we're adventurous, we're fun, we're exciting, we're doctors, we're lawyers, we're scholars. I always, and I'll close with this, is that my mom, she didn't go to high school, but she got a PhD in reservation life. And that to me, that's her story. And her story is just as important as your story. But it depends on who tells that story and how they tell it. And most writers come in and look for something that is dramatic and, I don't know, it looks like the savage Indian is attacking the United States again. And believe me, a lot of my talks are that. I do hold the United States accountable and the government. But there are wonderful stories about who we are. And so it just depends on who's telling that story and why is it important. And lastly, I think it's important because one of the things that we talked about a lot here is the future of what it looks like. There's not going to be a future if we keep destroying Mother Earth. And if you don't learn anything about traditional ecological knowledge, then we're going to continue the same pattern. And the way we describe it as 7 generations, we want to live like we're going to be in 7 generations. I'm going to die within the next 40 years or 20 years or whatever it may be. What am I going to leave my children? What are they going to leave their children? What are you going to leave your grandchildren? So that's the story that needs to be told, not just this monolithic story of Indigenous peoples.
Yeah, I think to second and third, all of what both of you said in terms of context is really important. I think it's really important to consider whether you're the right reporter for a story. Really particularly when covering extremism, whether you want to do unnecessary platforming of certain ideas, that sort of thing. These are all, and then of course how to go about doing a story, right? You might be into a story and realize that maybe you're not the right person to write it, or that you're not writing it properly. I think that is something that is often on the minds of journalists, and it's something to remind ourselves and consider. Another piece here, though, is that I think it can be really easy for journalists, particularly those of us who work either in breaking news or in regular news, to kind of keep telling the same story over and over and over again. And don't get me wrong, iterative reporting is very important. The idea of showing small movements and increases, that's somehow how we're able to track bigger stories. But at the same time, it's easy to get caught in a trap where you're really just holding up one story to the public, and only one story ends up getting told over and over and over again until people just believe that it's the only one worth telling. And the ironic thing about that is that's not really what we journalists believe at all. And in fact, there's this ineffable moment when we were talking about this when we were meeting as journalists before, where your voice changes when you realize that it's that moment. It goes from this is a story, which is how we kind of often refer to it in common parlance, is synonymous with article for us, to you say, oh, this is a story, right? And that little change signals that this is something that has not been animated or not been exposed to the public before, that you're introducing something new and important. And I think, balancing all the things we talked about earlier about, whether you're the right person to write it, what your platform, whether you're undue platforming, et cetera, but still looking for that spark. And I think those are the ones that, when we do our jobs properly, I think are most interesting and most important for the American public.
As an academic, that spirit of discovery, that looking for that spark, that's what kind of animates me as well. So it's been fascinating to look kind of into other professions, I think, and just imagine what that profession can teach you about your own. And so in the midst of these conversations, particularly with journalists who I've had less abilities to encounter in these types of intimate spaces, is the idea that in the academy, we are also, we're set out to inform and to advocate to a certain degree, and to stretch people's horizons. The purpose of kind of liberal arts is to liberate the mind through being exposed to ideas. And so I'm starting to think about some of the practices of a journalistic way of telling a story. Like, what would it mean to show up at a lecture that I'm giving and think about it, in a form like a journalist? Like, how would that enliven my academic modalities potentially? So this has been really rich. Just the professional engagement has been really rich.
So I want to open it up now to the rest of our colleagues who were part of our workshop with us over the last 3 days. I have some questions that I can ask to you all, but I first wanted to just, and we do have one colleague on Zoom also, so Natalie, if you want to chime in, just please do. But I wanted to just open it up first and see if any of you all have any kind of thoughts or reflections or things that sort of stuck out to you from these 3 days that you're going to be thinking about and that you hope we continue to think about in the coming months.
Now they're shy.
My name is Roger Childs. I'm commissioning editor of religious content for Ireland's national broadcaster, RTE. So there's a reason why we use words like media, which is the bit between, and channel, which is a pipe, basically. We are not the message. We're the means of getting the message between the source and the recipient. So I need to be in touch with both, and this has been really enriching for that reason. Half of what I do really is working out how to communicate the message from the people of faith to the audience, be they readers, listeners, or viewers. And in particular, in the culture that I'm in at the moment, there is hostility to a religion. So that's a game of stealth. You remember the old Clinton adage, the economy's stupid. My adage is the audience stupid. I have to be thinking about the audience constantly. What story am I trying to tell them, and why would they give their time and attention to me? And how am I going to engage their time and attention so that it'll be a rewarding experience for them, even if they don't expect it to be? So mine's a job of translation, really. It's translating the message of the people of faith to the people who may actually be hostile to the R-word religion, so that it's an enriching experience at the end of which we will all have a greater degree of literacy. My job isn't to teach people to believe or to give them a faith, it's to give them understanding. On the BBC, where I used to work, there's written in the stone, it says, "Nation shall speak peace unto nation." And I think the same applies to religion. Religion shall speak peace unto religion, but also to people of no religion. There needs to be mutual understanding. And that's how I see my role. And it's been an utterly enriching experience being here. Thank you very much for having me.
Our colleague Natalie, who's joining us virtually, also has a comment, so let's bring her in.
Hi, can you all hear me?
Yes, and see you too. Hi.
So I just wanted to share, I had such rich conversations with my groups, and in my trio group with Roger and Andrew. I think Roger identified, there's a prophetic voice, there's the voice of expertise, and then there's the person that, as he explained just now, is kind of mediating that channel, the media voice. And it was really helpful for me to think about how we have maybe overlapping goals, but also distinct approaches to how we do this. And he also said something that I found really helpful, that when we're telling difficult stories, or stories that people don't necessarily want to hear, how do we do that? Well, we share a human story. And I think this is what I'm really left with here, is that for many of us, we are trying to share experiences on the ground of how people are navigating very different worlds, navigating violence, dispossession, racialization, sexism, misogyny, right? Multiple forms of marginalization, right? But that ultimately, part of what we're doing as academics, as theologians, as media makers and journalists, is we're wanting to share stories because I think we ultimately want to cultivate and envision a new world. And how do we do that? But by continuing to challenge our assumptions that we carry, right? And by continuing to challenge one another's biases. And as Shannon said beautifully, ignorance, lack of understanding, right? Many of us are really just desperate to see the world beyond the blinders, right? What's beyond our purview? And I think that, and Dr. Ibrahim articulated this beautifully too, right? That we are trying to educate our students, but educate ourselves in the process. And I think so much of this is rehumanizing for all of us. And that's really what I've been left with. So I'm really grateful for that.
Thank you so much, Dr. Avalos. Nikhil?
Yeah, I think hi everyone, I'm Nikhil. I'm Deputy Executive Director of Hindus for Human Rights. One really interesting aspect of the discussions we've been having, I think, is for those presenters who come from religious minority communities, just talking about the internal complexity of a lot of these communities that doesn't always get covered or kind of attention in both media or academia or just popular kind of culture. And I think all of the cohort members really brought really nuanced and interesting perspectives of dealing with very complex issues around sexual abuse or patriarchy or religious nationalism in my case and within different faith communities. And I think just as a way to move forward or tell more nuanced stories, not just to include voices of minority communities, but multiple voices from those communities whenever possible is really important. I remember growing up, and even honestly through a few years ago, a lot of mainstream media stories about Hinduism or the Hindu community would usually include a quote from an organization called the Universal Society of Hinduism, which is based in the US. And it would be the same guy. And this is actually a one-man organization based in Reno, Nevada, who doesn't have a constituency, no membership or anything. He started an organization with a very grand name. And I think a lot of journalists would, see that on Google and be like, oh, there's the Hindu American, viewpoint. And it was just this one guy and his opinions. And I think we're still, a lot of articles still kind of make that mistake. And actually a South Asian journalist a few months ago wrote this piece of like, why is everyone interviewing this one guy? And so I think there's more kind of attention to that. But I think that phenomenon of just, maybe it's not always easy to access some of these communities, and that complexity is hard to access. But I think a more nuanced picture of even the smaller communities in this country would contribute a lot to discourse around religious futures and politics.
Okay. I'd like to, so we also kind of talked as a group before we came here, and people brought up some really interesting points. So I want to make sure we get to a few of those. Andrew, you and I chatted before this conversation, and you mentioned that one of the things that can be really complicated is that people who are not used to having these conversations, particularly in interfaith environments, may feel scared, nervous, threatened, worried, anxious about entering into these kinds of conversations. So I'm wondering what you think about how we bring those folks into this conversation, and also whether or not we have a responsibility to bring people into this conversation, or if it is their responsibility to say, I'm ready to enter into this interfaith pluralistic environment. Like, at what point do we say, you've got to do that work yourself? Like, so, how do you make the conversation accessible, and how do you allow these sorts of environments and conversations to happen outside of this kind of intentional space?
Thank you, Sarah. I think the heart of the shared story in our sacred traditions is that the other is our neighbor. There is someone who is connected to us and has equal value in the eyes of the divine, God, our creator. And I think that religious leaders, faith leaders, spiritual leaders have a responsibility to shape the imaginations of our communities with our best stories that center that. So, for example, for me as a Christian, one of the most famous stories that Jesus told was about how you connect with God and go to heaven. And that story was about seeing the dignity of the religious heretic, the political enemy, the ethnic other, and recognizing them as a reflection of God and the embodiment of the neighbor. And I think that when faith leaders are telling those kinds of stories within our communities, and I think that they're in all of our traditions, we begin to have new eyes to see the other person who may initially seem unfamiliar or threatening or dangerous as someone who actually might surprise us with God, or surprise us with dignity and hope and learning. And that's what I've experienced in this gathering here. I was telling a friend that we visited the cathedral this afternoon, but my real church experience was right in this room with each one of you. I think faith leaders can tell these stories from our own traditions of, look, our own authoritative texts and practices are inviting us to see divine dignity inside of the other person that our culture wars may be asking us to see as less or unrelated than ourselves. And I think that each one of us can go out of this gathering telling the story of what a profound experience I had with Shannon, and learning from him about his ceremonies that sustain his patience and courage in the face of extraordinary othering, dehumanization, erasure, and eradication. So I want to be someone who's telling the story of, this is where I'm meeting God and experiencing a deep sense of meaning. And I think we can all do that. Thank you.
Kind of on a related note, I think one of the other things that came up, especially today, I think in different ways it came up in all of our conversations today, was a point that Justin made, which is that, while we've been here, we've really challenged ourselves to create kind of what we've been talking about as maybe a liminal space, right? Something that's not one thing or the other, but that exists because of the intersection of multiple things. And it is really been, I think, a lovely experience for us to have that in so many different ways here and with so many different people here. But how do we create those spaces outside of this kind of context, outside of this kind of environment? And why is it so difficult in a world where we know that we're all kind of, we also talked a little bit about the idea that we're all influenced and shaped by many things. None of us are just, one thing. A scholar at USC, Josh Kuhn, talks about how none of us are single inputs. We are all samples. So if we think about the fact that we're all complex and we're all mosaics, why is it so difficult to create those kind of liminal spaces or spaces where we can have that nuance and that complication outside of this environment, and how do we make them?
Yeah, that was very well said. Thank you, Sarah. Just to add to that, something very special about this conference was the way it was framed from the very beginning. Invited us to bring our whole selves here, not just ourselves as representatives of our profession, which is kind of what a lot of us experience at our conferences. So in a sense, we brought a certain sacredness to this place, and it felt very much like we could be vulnerable in a way that we could in a sacred space. And I think a lot of us felt that. So my question, and I kind of open this up to everybody, and I would say get in touch with Alex if you have good ideas, is how do we bring that back to our real lives, quote unquote, back when we leave this place? We can't all fly to Notre Dame twice a year and do this to sustain this. So how do we do this back in our homes and where life suddenly kind of takes back over? Because something special like this, I think, is needed for, it needs to be repeated in order to really ripple out into society more broadly. Thank you.
And does anyone have a thought about that? Can you answer that question? How do we do that? No, if you, I mean, I'm curious if any of our colleagues, because I know that is something we've been thinking about and talking about at our dinners together and our meals and outside of our structured conversations too. How do you plan to take these ideas outside of this room? Yeah, go for it.
I mean, I've already started trying to learn about the indigenous histories of the city that I live in, and how can I build relationships with indigenous spiritual leaders in my hometown. There's a Hindu temple like 5 minutes from where I live. I confess I've never been there. I want to go there and meet people and start developing relationships and practicing that whole self vulnerable relationship building right where I live. That's one way.
It's okay if we don't have all the answers right now. I think part of too what we've talked about is being comfortable with discomfort and thinking about the fact that many of the things that we do and the issues that we talk about do not have clean answers. They have very messy ones and messy endings. And I think about some of the stories I've worked on that I want to just sort of like, you know, episode 10 of the podcast, like put a nice, beautiful bow on it and everybody feels really satisfied. And it's almost never possible to do that. So to really think about being comfortable with that discomfort and what does it mean to have empathy? And part of really developing empathy for each other is, I think, sitting with discomfort and sitting with uncomfortable truths and sitting with truths that have not been part of your worldview and really like dealing with that. Joshua, I'd like to ask you if you have anything to add about that, because you've taken such a unique and I think admirable approach to recognizing problematic aspects of our faith and culture and really addressing them head on and you know, making sure that you know you identify so strongly as a Jew and you identify also so strongly with your values that I think are quite reflected in Judaism, but maybe not in all of its texts or all of its liturgy or all of its teachings. So how do you think about creating those new spaces?
Well, for those of us, I think maybe that have traditions that are very much text-based traditions, I think that a lot of it has to do with text study. And you mentioned that there are, that the progressive values that I aspire to are something that very much come out of my faith tradition. We need to shed a light on those. We also need to shed a light on the things that are less pleasant. And we need to connect the dots from here to there. And those aren't dots oftentimes that we can connect for other people. But when you begin to sit down with a text that you are predisposed to respect, it can be very difficult to look at it as if the other were reading it. And I think that, you know, I don't know, I probably sound like all sorts of clergy. Why won't they read anything about their own tradition, right? But I think that people who take religion seriously need to get familiar enough with their religion that they can speak about it and speak from it as a moral compass.
Thank you. I want to kind of put one more question out there, and then we're going to open it up to you all to ask questions and have dialogue together. You made a really beautiful point, and raised this question that I struggle with a lot, especially in this moment in time, which is, how do we think about creating a space to uplift ourselves and one another? How do we have a healthy sense of wonder and optimism when we look at the world? And at the same time, not have it come at the expense of bearing witness to ongoing pain and to brokenness and to things that are difficult and problematic. And I think this question that you raise comes up a lot, not only when we talk about faith, but we also talked a lot about how do you talk about people who identify not as being spiritual, not as being religious, who do not identify as having a faith. And I think a lot about kind of this moment we're in with the climate and with our earth, and dealing with the grief of knowing that we're, some days it feels like we're living on a dying planet. And so how do we reconcile these sort of very, very difficult, grief-laden ideas and still find, those moments of hope?
It's a big question. I think for me, relationship is essential. Like, I feel like I can't hold what do they say, the 10,000 joys and the 10,000 sorrows of the world alone. It's impossible to do it alone. So for me, relationship is really at the foundation, and that's been really evident, in this time together, that I felt that we kind of formed something really special happened this over this conference that's really impacted us all. I think that, certainly academics, and I think also journalists, can be a little disaffected, a little cynical, a little rote. I'm not going to include faith leaders, I'm not sure. Perhaps a little bit, but not as much. But there's something sacred happened in this meeting, in this encounter, over these 3 days. And I think I want to thank our hosts. I think it started that we were literally invited into the home of our hosts. They opened their home to us. And then we were asked, the first instruction we were given was to listen. And I feel like I learned to listen again over these 3 days. So being in relationship and listening and welcoming all of the joys and all of the sorrows into our home, our actual homes and our kind of symbolic homes, is all that's kind of emerging right now for me. Thanks for that lovely question.
Yeah. Do any of our colleagues, maybe particularly ones who haven't spoken, have anything else that they'd like to add before we open it up to questions from the audience? Okay, then let's go ahead and open it up to questions from you all. You can also just observations, comments, thoughts, things that come up for you when you think about this. I know it can be tricky to figure out what to ask in a situation like this, but I think part of what, as everyone has said, this was really a space where we all kind of felt pretty vulnerable and we're pretty open with each other in ways that I think is not always common at professional meetings, professional conferences. So, I invite you to feel comfortable or uncomfortable with your own vulnerability and to still share that.
Not to put anyone on the spot, but there's a team of nuclear physicists here who came to pontificate on humanity's future and religious futures. So if any of you want to kind of respond to what you've heard and what you were expecting, and maybe have a conversation that way as well.
Yeah, I'd love to know what you were expecting.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for putting me on the spot. So I'm Ani Abrahamian. I'm from the physics department. I'm a nuclear physicist, and I invited my colleagues to join me because I said they're going to talk about the future of humanity. Let's go do that instead of having our research meeting today. I'm ethnically Armenian, as you can tell from my name, Ani Abrahamian. It's a little hard for us to appreciate the kumbaya with which you guys are talking here. I mean, at the moment, Armenia, part of Nagorno-Karabakh, is isolated, and there's a lot of violence, and people are freezing. And I mean, I wanted to know about the journalist side because 2 years ago there was a severe war, and nobody paid any attention to it. There were no journalists there. There was nobody telling our story, basically. And now we have this global situation. I don't know what our future is taking us. I mean, I'm encouraged by the news about fusion, but that might save. I told my students this morning, your asses just got saved today. I was teaching a whole semester on energy and how bad things were for the planet. So at least I was expecting to hear what you think about the future of humanity. As a scientist, when we talk to people, always worried about how is that information being received. And I've done a lot of reading about who believes you when you talk. And the people who believe you are the ones that are like you. So what solutions do you have for talking to the people who are not like you?
I'll start, but I hear from Jack, and then if any other colleagues want to jump in too, please. First, I just want to validate what you're saying, because I think it is not, I think when you get a lot of people who think a lot about religion or spirituality into a room together, I've seen this happen at, have you noticed this at RNA too, at their, like the Religion News Association conference, where it can sort of get to a space where it does feel a little bit like, okay, we're all kind of operating on like a spiritual plane now and everything is going to be okay. And I don't think that that's the reality most of the time. And so I just want to validate what you're saying and your question. And I don't know if this is helpful or not, but I mean, I feel a sense of despair a lot of the time. And I've spoken with other colleagues who do too. And I do some work. I'm not a climate reporter and I'm not an expert on climate, but I have worked on a handful of climate shows and have also been working at the intersection of religion and the environment for a little bit. And so it is something that I think about a lot. For me, the way I think about talking with and listening to and being listened to by people who are not like me, it's a very challenging thing. And I don't think that there's a perfect model for it. I think a lot of it involves the listening. And I think a lot of the communities that I work in are religious communities that are particularly insular and have often had very bad experiences with journalists. And so usually I have to first do this work of saying, I know that the journalists have done you dirty and I'm not going to do that to you. And then they say, yeah, I've heard that before. And then we have to have more conversations. So I think a lot of it is listening and really understanding that concern and understanding the impact that it has on someone. Like, journalists are in a really immense position of power, and choosing to cover or not cover a story and choosing the way that story is covered I mean, like, I really think that that's a sacred responsibility, and I know many of my colleagues do too. So I think the first thing is trying really to be humble and to really listen, and be. I try to begin my conversations by listening first, and I have found it an effective way. Then I think people are able to better hear me afterwards. But I also don't think it's perfect, and I also think that I can move through certain spaces easier than other people can. And I try to think about what's my positionality and where are my points of privilege. And if I'm able to move through a space and ask questions, I think we talked about this earlier today. Some of us are able to say things that other people can't, and some of us are able to ask things that other people can't. And so thinking about our position of privilege and trying to use that as Shannon mentioned, not to be an ally, but to be an accomplice to others, and to really think about what that means. So I don't think this is like a perfect answer, but I think a lot of it is listening first and knowing that it takes a really long time, and building up those relationships takes a long time. And I also don't blame people if they don't want to build relationships with everyone. And I think that differs from some of my very generous colleagues who have found ways to build relationships in many difficult situations. And I don't know that everyone should have to do that, but yeah, I think it's a lot of listening. What do you think, Jack?
Yeah, a few things. I mean, the question you talked about, just the lack of coverage for a very similar event. Unfortunately, that is a common theme in my profession, right? Like how many times have we had major events occur, and only in retrospect do we hear mea culpas from the media, right? Like, oh, we probably should have covered that before it became a genocide, right? Like that's kind of a retroactive thing, and the politics and the economics often of why that occurs is a unfortunately recurring conversation. You can go all the way back throughout journalistic history. That includes the lead up to World War II. That includes any number of conflicts in the 20th century and the 21st. It has been a failure of journalism often, and the answers are often really unsatisfying as to why those things occur. But I think bringing up climate change also kind of points to a really interesting piece here, because in my old job, before I worked at Religion News Service, I worked in a newsroom and actually sat next to our climate team. And I was doing my little religion reporting, and I was like, oh, look, I covered this protest today. And they're like, was it about climate change? Because the world is burning. And I would just be like, okay, I'll bring over some drinks. But I mean, it was an interesting intersection with those reporters, though, because one of the big issues that they ran into is they often felt like, you're like, look, I'm finding as many angles as I can on this issue of climate change, and like I'm only going to get so many readers, and it's like so hard, this methodical slog to have people care about it. And unfortunately, a lot of it, there was a degree to which media increasing its coverage of climate change did bring more people in, but a lot of times it was because people were affected by it. They're like, oh, I guess I should care about this now, right? And it's part of the same reason that conflicts don't get covered if you don't feel directly impacted by it. That having been said, what has been interesting is when faith leaders and spiritual leaders have gotten involved in this conversation, right? Two of the big ones I would point to is one, the involvement of Pope Francis and his encyclical on the environment, and two, the actions of Indigenous rights protesters, right? I mean, one of the most covered events when it came to climate protests of the last 10 years was Standing Rock, right? And so that's a community that has done a lot of work to bring attention to this and other issues. And unfortunately, that's often how news coverage works, is that prominent leaders or through sheer force of protest are how things garner attention and garner coverage. And my expectation for the future is that there will continue to be live coverage. Just this past week, the Washington Post, while they are also apparently laying off a bunch of reporters, they have decided that they're going to hire, it looks like 20 more climate reporters, if I heard that correctly. And so it gives them a whole staff of 30 either reporters or journalists working on that subject, just at the Washington Post, to kind of prioritize that as coverage. And I think part of that is out of people are being affected by this now, and so they want to know more about it. But I think another part of that is that people are. That took years and years and years of work to get to that place, and unfortunately, that is often how it happens. Although I grew up, my dad was taught thermodynamics and physics at a nuclear power and testing facility, and so I was really excited about the fusion news. And since you were excited, that makes me even more excited, because maybe we're not all going to die. But I don't know. I know that doesn't probably satisfactorily answer your question, but I do think there is actually a religion angle there in terms of how that could impact. And I think you will continue to see moving forward into the future more faith communities take this seriously, irrespective of tradition, because it's what's impacting their communities. And I mean, faith communities in certain parts of the world have been talking about this for quite some time for that exact reason. But I think it sounds like you want to say something, so.
Yeah, I just want to say that I'm excited too about hopefully that things will start to change, but infrastructure is lacking, right? We don't have the process and the ability to get energy to these communities. There are 490 million indigenous peoples in the world. They protect 80% of the world's pristine ecosystems. So the question that you first posed was, there was a war happening and nobody wrote about it. Welcome to our world. Indigenous peoples in the United States, where we have access to media and every channel in the world and every access to story, but rarely do you hear about Native people. And I'm not trying to do a comparison here. I'm just saying that when we talk about these things that are newly developed, and we talk about stories that where we got Russia and Ukraine who are in the middle of this battle for resources, land, and territory. Again, another colonized ideology, right? That the kumbaya moment is not that for me. It is that we have to talk specifically about how and why these people are dying, whether it's in your country or my country. Access to story, access to resources is extremely important. People are dying in your country at this moment. They're freezing, they're cold, or whatever is happening with there. And it's happening here. All of us have to come up with a solution. I was talking to my young friend over there. He's 18 years old and a freshman in this school, and he wants to become a doctor. And I'm excited for him. But the reality is that, as I mentioned earlier, what are we going to leave in 8 generations or 7 generations for these kids? We're all excited about this news, but what does it mean for the world, right? America, great. It sounds wonderful. But what does it mean having access to some of these, whether it's a story, whether it's a reporter that will write that story, or whether it's resources in the country, in a community, or a nation that is extremely wealthy? There are people there are the haves and the have-nots, and we've been on the have-nots list for a long time. So I appreciate that, and you're right, we don't have writers to the story. Standing Rock happened, Mauna Kea happened. We see these pipelines going through and treaty violations constantly on indigenous lands. Remains that my brother over there spoke about at universities that still need to be released, that are indigenous remains. So, I mean, we're not going to solve these problems in 30 minutes or an hour, but if we come together and we have these really hard conversations, this is an ongoing conversation that we need to have. And I believe that this young man, I told him that, we're all good. All of folks with gray hair are going to pass away soon. It's up to his responsibility. He's dry. Well, maybe not, but he's responsible, especially you young folks. You're responsible to changing the narrative. Yeah. All right. Yeah.
And I wanted to just, I thought about what I said, and I just wanted to offer one point of clarification, which is that I said, that Shannon made this excellent point about being not an ally, but an accomplice, and thinking about working together in community with others. And that is a tricky thing, I think, for journalists, because there is an expectation that journalists are not, going to be advocating for particular points of view. And I think there's a lot to be said about that, and we don't need to get into that conversation today, but I think I just wanted to, clarify that by that I mean that, I try to think holistically about my work, and what does it mean to be an accomplice of humanity? And what does it mean to be an accomplice of, serving the people that need to be served? Oh, we've got Natalie coming in on Zoom too.
Hi, I clearly like talking, but I really wanted to respond to that question because I think, you know, the convergence of our voices, you know, thinking about the journalists, the academic, and those that are essentially prophetic voices, right? Faith leaders. And part of the boon of converging these voices is that prophetic voices especially can help inspire us, but also help us recognize our power. Part of what I'm hearing in that question is that we are powerless. We are anything but powerless. We have way more power. And I hear this from very powerful people all the time. Well, what can we do? You know, a prophetic voice can help shake us out of our passivity, can disabuse us of the illusion that we were powerless. Journalists can help platform those voices. Academics can also help platform and contextualize those voices. And I think if we were converging more, these three groups, it would help us see that any kind of mobilization, like we saw with Occupy Wall Street, like we saw with the Arab Spring, like we saw at Standing Rock, any kind of mass mobilization can make dramatic change. And so I don't think there's any need for us to be overwhelmed with grief. We can choose to act and work together. And I just wanted to share that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Natalie.
Can I just make a small observation at the risk of boring and coming in again? Just, I'm not a scientist, but when I first saw the logo for the Ansari Institute, I thought I was looking at COVID-20, a molecule of COVID-20, but it's been explained to me in the last couple of days that actually what it represents is an ideal, which is what underpins the Ansari Institute, which is a representation of difference, to address your point. But it's difference not merging, difference converging. The strands here remain different. We're not becoming assimilated. But the idea is that the braid is stronger than the thread. And I think that's what I've got from this exercise is, you know, Natalie spoke about the crying need for prophetic voices. God, yeah, we need some, don't we? But I think I've heard a few in this convocation in the last couple of days as well.
My question is for Shannon. Since you mentioned your mother,
Yep.
I'm curious how you would describe this encounter that you've had this week to her.
What did I say to my friends? I said, I'm meeting with a bunch of crazy white people. Not all of you are white, but I'm just saying. Yeah. I spoke about my mother a lot because I tease her, you know, half the year she's Christian, half the year she's Indian. And because it's Christmas, she's Christian. I guess how I would explain it to her, like any other work that I've done, and I used to be at the UN for about 10 years, and I was part of the Global Caucus chair there on Indigenous issues that impacted the world and of Indigenous peoples, but mainly in the South and North America and Canada. And she always worried about me, like everywhere I went. She thought that the white people were out to get me all the time. And I told her that I have our ancestors behind us, and that a warrior is not someone who carries a bow and arrow all the time. A warrior is one that hangs it on top of his door, and he opens that door and he says, have some water, sit down with me and eat. And that's what we're doing here. We're having water, we're sitting down to eat, and we're conversating about some of the most difficult things that plague our planet. And one of them is religion. We are spiritual people. We're not religious people. So get that out of your head. Be spiritual. And so, like my mother, who is tough, short, and round, and can beat me up probably. But there's the three things that she always reminds me of being an O'otham, which we call O'otham Himadak, our way of life. And she always reminds me that our three things that an O'otham should always have: love, compassion, and patience. And I've tried my best to have that. I'm not my children will tell you I'm not the most compassionate or loving or patient father. But like my mother, I tried to be that. And she's not always loving and patient either. But I think about her, and I think when I go home, well, I'll see her Friday. And she asks me the same thing every morning: do you want something to eat? And I scream no, because she burns everything, because she's old, and I love her, but I can make my own egg sandwich. Thank you very much. But love, compassion, and patience is what I'll tell her that this room gave us today.
We can do other, I think we probably have time for one or two more questions, thoughts, comments, reflections. We had this problem earlier today where Shannon, his presentation was just incredible and really emotional, and no one wanted to go after him. We had to take a break so that there was a reset.
I'm sorry.
I've just enjoyed having the presence of this other discipline in the room. So many things in life happen just by chance, and I think maybe the Ansari Institute has a new direction, in fact, for a quadrilogue of sorts. So I'm really resonating just that we need to be in a creative headspace in order to solve a lot of the problems that we face. We need to be in relationships of trust, and that it's one thing to build them when a crisis is already happening, but are there relationships that we can sort of proactively build, if we need an excuse to build a relationship? But that's also something I think about regularly, how to be in a headspace, a heart space that is welcoming, sort of that doesn't get empathy fatigue, that doesn't that doesn't go into a space of kind of collapse into selfishness or something. And so I think these are basic, maybe human practices. And I think what sometimes religious practitioners bring to the mix is that this training, that they've been doing this for a while and can kind of help the rest of us along in doing these things. So I think just as it's maybe essential to understand our world from the scientific perspective so we can manipulate it to our benefit, we also our whole psychological ecosystem, it needs to be understood. And I think that's the business of faith leaders, often, to help us figure out how to unlock those our higher capacities.
Can I just say that when the host told us that nuclear physicists were in the room, I felt like my intelligence dropped by about 10 points. So.
I did just want to add real quick just to respond to your comment about the kumbaya element, right? And it helps that we're all awesome people, and so but I don't want to undersell that as I'm a reporter who covers religion and politics, and I cover both of those as well. And what's interesting, what I found, this is not an advocacy conference. This is not an instance in which people are trying to build political power. But what I found is really interesting is that those kumbaya movements are how different coalitions emerge, irrespective across the political spectrum, right? The religious right was a coalition built in kumbaya moments around 2 or 3 issues, and they have continued to impact our politics to this day. The religious left is a much broader and more complicated series of coalitions that have a lot of these kumbaya moments, but they have managed to punch through and help. You know, I bored my colleagues earlier with how like the Affordable Care Act can thank Catholic nuns for its passage. That's not me saying that. Barack Obama said that, and that's often how if people are trying to impact big issues, when it comes down to getting a law passed, when it comes down to getting a demonstration to draw attention to an issue, it is a lot of that, like, you know, somewhat uncomfortable feeling, coalition building. I can't tell you the number of times I've been a reporter in the room being like, this is like a lot. But like my job is to like document this, these relationships forged across difference. So I wouldn't undersell that as a key, if you exist in a democratic system where coalitions turn into voting blocks or turn into systems of power. Those are actually like one of the more important things that people do. That doesn't mean that they're always successful. The fact that we're still talking about climate change, and you know, we didn't nip it in the bud like decades ago is evidence of that. But I think that's been really interesting to hear, both from the faith leaders and the academics during this conference, is when looking towards the future, the number of coalitions that I wasn't even fully aware had already been forged across religious lines, but also ideological, racial, gender identity lines that end up showing up at protests or end up showing up at conferences that I'm covering. And it has shed light on that. So moving forward into our religious future, I am curious to see how those coalitions continue to emerge. And I mean that on again, across the religious spectrum. There's a lot of interesting things happening on the right too. We can talk about Ye and Nick Fuentes all day. There's a Catholic angle there. But I think that those are things to continue to watch. You know, one of my favorite things that was brought up during this conference is the idea of a crossfade that you were talking about, the idea that it's blending one audio clip into another one, but using that as a metaphor for explaining certain kinds of communities. And it really seems like the United States is in the midst of a giant crossfade, and certain things are ending and other things are beginning, and making sense of that has been really interesting to hear from all my colleagues here looking forward.
I want to build on the kumbaya part. I'm a minister and a professional ethicist. It really hit a chord, I think. I'm like the least kumbaya-oriented person I know. And I came here and I talked about the dark side of organ transplants, like really wrestling a negative story out of all of these positive stories. But I think the thing that gives me hope, because I'm like, wow, I am leaving here with some hope, is that I was in a room for 3 or 4 days with other people who also see the problems and want to address those problems. And I feel so much more connected and trusting that other really invested people are on the beat, right? And that they're going to do that. And I feel like there's a lot of hope in the relationships that we've built, and a lot of hope in the relationships that all of us will go out and build to address these problems. And so maybe there is a little bit of kumbaya now, but like not originally for me, for sure.
I know we're just kind of to time, so I think maybe if there's kind of one last closing comment or thought that anyone wants to share, but we're just about to time. Yeah.
I just wanted to say something that the philosophers discuss and physicists discuss. It's called the prisoner's dilemma. And I really wish, so all of you are nodding your head. Lots of scientists don't know about that. But the outcome is that when everyone cooperates, everyone is a bigger winner than when one particular group tries to have more than the rest. So I wish we could somehow get that message across to the world.
Well, I think certainly I like to think those things come in small, tiny steps, and or maybe not linear steps, but circuitous ones or roundabout ones. And I think I don't want to speak for everyone, but I will say that I think we all seem to feel quite grateful to have had this time with each other, and hope to carry some of these ideas with us back into our own professions, into our homes, into our houses of worship, into the spaces that we inhabit. And I hope that this is the first of, or the third of many conversations, of many more trilogues. So we're just so incredibly grateful that you all brought us together. Thank you so much to our hosts, to the Ansari Institute, to Notre Dame, to the Keough
Our
School,
moderator.
yeah, thank you, to the Arthur Vining Davis Foundation, to everyone for just coming with open hearts and open minds, and for just really setting a space where we could have these kinds of conversations, and where we leave in a way where we want to continue to have them. So thank you all so much for being here.